Welcome to the Control the Room podcast, a series devoted to the exploration of meeting culture and uncovering cures for the common meeting. Some meetings have tight control and others are loose. To control the room means achieving outcomes while striking a balance between imposing and removing structure, asserting and distributing power, leaning in and leaning out, all in the service of having a truly magical meeting. Today I'm with Harold Hardaway, CEO of Cardigan, where they're cultivating brands that inspire employees. Welcome to the show, Harold.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. Well, I wanted to start off by hearing a little bit about your history. I'm always fascinated by how facilitators find their way to their roles because, let's just face it, there's no degree at any college where you go become a facilitator. So there's always a fascinating journey. And especially when we're looking at all these different silos and different methodologies, people come from totally different worlds. So I'm really curious to hear how you got here.
Yeah, I probably stumbled into it like most people, like you were saying. So no degrees here to kind of get there. So when I first started out my career, I worked at a mortgage bank and they didn't have a training department, right? It was a new division. And so in the absence with no one raising their hand to develop training, I raised my hand and I was the trainer for that particular group. And so I think through that, I kind of learned how to explain things 2-3 different ways to someone. At the same time, I was in a group with business analysts, and through that process, they were working on developing systems, and then I would have to sort of train the system, but I would be in the room when they would start working on what that was going to look like, how it was going to operate. And so being able to really translate how the business was using the tool versus how they were designing it. So between the business and IT and translating there, being able to speak both languages really helped a lot. After that, I worked at a large grocery retailer here in Texas. So I'm sure everyone can probably guess who that is, in the IT department. And HR was my customer. So you can imagine with developing technology with them, there was a lot of translation needed. Like, I want this. And then IT saying, well, we can't necessarily do that. And it's like, well, what they're really asking for is this, right? And can you live with this? Because I think, it'll still get you the business outcomes that you want. And so being able to, hear both sides and translate and help them negotiate an 80 or a 90% solution was really important. And then, once I got taken off of HR technology, HR just kind of hired me to go work in that department. And through the rest of my career, there was a lot of translating and taking big ideas, which is how I ended up in communications, right? Taking big ideas and being able to kind of translate that down and then navigate people through a process to get to a business outcome. So honestly, most of the times it's because someone didn't raise their hand, and in that space I did and figured I'd give it a shot, and I learned a lot and, ended up facilitating. I also am a little bit of a ham and an extrovert, and I don't mind being up front.
We talked about that a little bit, the importance of being this unbiased third party that's kind of coming in and helping the team be the heroes. But there is still an element of performance. You have to prepare, be on your game, get up there, and even if you're kind of stepping off to the side a bit at times or a lot at times, there is still that moment of like, hey, the show's on, and I gotta be there. And before we started recording, you were mentioning that you had some experience in stand-up comedy, etc. And so just curious to hear how those experiences have related, and if you've actually dipped into any of that when you've been planning sessions.
Yeah, a lot of times, when you're up there, no one wants a boring facilitator, right? It's about being effective. It's about getting their goals accomplished. But if someone's going to be in a room with you for 4 to 8 hours, to an extent, it would be nice if you can entertain. So way back when I kind of was living in Dallas, it was this mortgage banking crisis, and they laid off all support functions. So like 600 of us kind of in one day. And in that space, I was like, what are some things I've always wanted to try? And it was like stand-up comedy. So I did that, actually got paid to do it. So I am a paid stand-up comedian. It was just $100, but I'll take it and I'll claim it any day of the week. But I think what that really allows me to do is pay attention to what's happening, timing, is important to kind of like lay down the joke. And I think timing is also really important when it comes to facilitation, right? So when are you quiet? When do you give space? When do you step in and say something? Also listening to what other people are saying, and how do you bring things back around? So part of a comedy, right? You'll say something and then you'll navigate people through a process, and then you bring the joke back around, and then it hits harder the second time because, people kind of feel it. So with facilitation, you'll set something up at the beginning, and then you'll kind of have hopefully this full circle moment where like the light bulb goes off for everyone. So I think not being afraid to be in front of people, some comedic timing, understanding sort of that cycle of bringing things back and helping people kind of understand the light bulb goes off helps a lot when it comes to facilitating.
So I want to double stitch on that, bringing things back, because you talked about in the pre-show kind of prep conversation, you talked about this notion of kind of cultural inside jokes, or the words they use, or getting to know them. And so I thought that was really, really neat. And how can I not only come in as an unbiased outsider and be that person that doesn't necessarily have any stake in this decision, so that I'm not going to influence it, but at the same time, how can I be a friend and ally, kind of fit in so that everyone feels comfortable and vulnerable, right? And so how much does that kind of bringing it back, the timing, the improv, comedy stuff, align with that ability to kind of like dissect the culture and then imbibe that into the experience?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think they're equally important, right? So timing is huge, but also, if you're an outsider, you need people to trust you. To your point, you need them to open up. You need them to be vulnerable. So ingratiation is actually kind of an impression management technique. So part of it is I'm also a teacher at some of the universities. So you'll hear some nerdy stuff kind of come out of my mouth every once in a while. But how can I ingratiate myself to someone quickly? So I can do it with a smile. I might be able to say, oh, look, I've done this for so many people. But at the same time to say, hey, I did my homework and I know a little bit about you. I know the words that you use. I know what's important to you. It makes people think, oh, wow. And you can see it in their face where they start paying a little bit more attention. So an example of that, I had a facilitation. I was actually just speaking, but it was a little bit like some workshop fun activities in there. And so I was like, well, give me 3. We were talking about personal brand. Give me 3 words, that you would say describe who you are. Or someone would say, that Harold, he's blank, blank, and blank. How would you want them to fill that in, right? In terms of personal brand. And they had this whole thing called more. They were like, well, if we were to do more, and so I said, I'm asking you for 3, but if you'd like to do more, you could do 4, right? And everyone in the room burst out laughing and thought it was the funniest thing ever. But it's just because I asked, like, what are some things you say culturally? What are some things that you do? What are the inside jokes? And if they're, what are you working on? What's important in terms of an initiative? If you'll share some of the last emails that have gone out, if you want to, then I can kind of work all that in. And so it doesn't feel so much like an outsider, but a continuation of where the organization, is really headed. And so that was just kind of a fun example that always sticks out in my head.
Yeah, I love this notion of not only adding levity to the situation, but also getting people to really resonate with these broader themes and these broader objectives, or how does it tie back to whatever the business outcomes are. And you mentioned the importance of that in this notion of planning, and the purpose of the planning is to have the plan, but we want to be skilled enough that we can deviate from it. And so we often talk about anti-fragile agendas. So we want to build our agendas so that like we can blow them up if we need to. And I strongly believe that if you're not focused on the outcomes, you can't do that. So that got me really excited when you were talking about those things. So I'm curious to hear how you think about plans, how you think about outcomes, and as that relates to just having a great facilitation.
Yeah. So, from a client perspective, I will always say, like, what are 1 or 2 things that at the end, if we accomplish this, you would be like, wow, I didn't waste my money on this guy, right? Or if it's, my business partner, Shannon, on Cardigan, right? So, and be very clear about those. and come up with a plan about how we're specifically going to get there. And what that really does is, I think as a facilitator, allows you to, number one, not get frazzled and know that you have a path to get there, right? And I'm going to say a path because you know what I'm going to bring up in a second. You have a path to get there. And if there's a process and you've planned for it, I always say if something goes wrong, if I've planned enough, plan A, plan B, then it's going to be easy for me to pivot, you know? And so I've also been responsible for corporate events with like 2,000 people in the room. And so I'm like, we are going to kill ourselves to try to make this quote unquote perfect. And I always say it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to have the appearance of perfection. But once we got started, I was like, if the whole, you know, if the roof falls in, oh well, at least we exhausted every opportunity, right? So to me, the plan is an outline, you know, is a structure. You have to be able to, like we talked about comedy, right? Read the room, what's going to work, what's not working, and be willing to say it's not going to work. The other thing though with the plan, and I love this concept that I learned in school called like equifinality. And there can be infinite ways to get to the same ending, right? So just because I had this one particular way I thought we can navigate people through the process, if I've done a good job creating space, if I've done a good job aligning people, getting people to open up and speak up, then maybe someone else is going to throw something out. It's going to spark some sort of creativity, and my plan is no longer the best one, right? But just recognizing and realizing that there's multiple ways to get there. The plan is a framework to kind of keep you on track and also to get your customer to understand where you're going as well. But throw it away if it doesn't work. So don't stick to it and don't feel like you have to cleave to it, because I've seen so many facilitators do that. And then at the end, you didn't accomplish anything you want to accomplish, but you stuck to your plan. And that's not what you were really getting paid to do.
Yeah, when you started talking about equifinality earlier, my brain started doing this fractaling thing. It was like, because it's kind of meta if you think about it. Because when we're planning, we want to make sure that we don't have this fixed mindset, that we can be adaptable and willing to adjust on the fly as needed. But also, all of these facilitation approaches, no matter if you're in design land or liberating structures land or wherever, they're kind of based off this concept of equifinality, right? Because we want to make sure we bring everyone to the table, and what happens in the room happens. So there's these emergent qualities that we're there to seek out. And so if we come in with this fixed mindset around what the outcome's going to be specifically, then the session's not going to be very valuable, or we don't get the deep work doesn't happen that we're kind of seeking for. So I thought it's really interesting that concept works on multiple levels. It's like at the participant level, it's at the facilitator level, and we all have to embrace that if we want to really get the interstellar outcomes.
Yeah, and I think that comes from, to your point, the process. I think it also comes from language. And I'll give you an example. You know, we've recently done a lot of webinars on like navigating through crises, et cetera, because there are multiple going on at one time now. And then we're like, how do you talk to your people? It relates to your brand. And so one example we'll use is like, do you talk to them like a cheerleader? Do you talk to them like familial, right? But that was when we were talking to HR leaders. When we were speaking to people maybe in oil and gas, we were like, do you talk to people like a coach? You know what I mean? We start changing language because words matter, and like people can like receive them. So are they all men? Are they primarily women? Are they CPAs? Are they like advertising people? And kind of getting, that understanding that, the exercise changes, the words, the language that you use changes, so it can be received well by the receiver, because that's the point, right? You don't want to alienate someone with language as well. So language also is a big part.
It also, like, I begin to think about like not only what's happening in the room, what's happening to your agenda, to how you're just even approaching the facilitation, what's happening in the room with the participants, but also what's happening to all the participants outside the room. So, all the stuff that they're dealing with, and the baggage they bring in, the trauma, the stress, et cetera. And I think that has an element of equifinality to it as well, because, those things are going to have a way of resolving themselves. And all this lives in this ecosystem. It's like Russian nested dolls or something, right?
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
And so it brings me back to this thing you mentioned around acknowledging and creating space for these things that everyone's dealing with, whether it be racial unrest or, whether it be some bomb just blew up at work, like there's a production outage. Like, people are bringing stuff into the room, emotions into the room. I loved your word acknowledge, because I think a lot of facilitators will say holding space. And like that's kind of a very facilitator term, whereas acknowledge is like, that's a term everyone can understand. And we just want to like take some time and honor it and let people have that transition moment, because if we can't expect them to flip a switch and just like throw this stuff to the side. So I know you had a recent moment that felt kind of special around giving people the ability to acknowledge.
Yeah, I was in a meeting, and then I borrowed this from someone, so it's not a Harold Hardaway original, as I like to say. Everyone was, as we say, feeling some type of way about something, right? With all the racial unrest, and knowing you have introverts and extroverts, and maybe some people want to talk, some people don't want to talk. And it was on a Zoom meeting, and we've been on so many of those recently. The thing, was, hey, think of one, maybe two words that describe how you feel, and type it into the chat. And, you don't have to say it, but as the facilitator, she read them out loud. And when I did it and borrowed it from her, I read it out loud. And people were like, tired, exhausted, hopeful. And there's just something really powerful about reading those things out loud, acknowledging where people are in the space. And so you, as a facilitator, kind of know what people are bringing with them. And at the same time, opening it up and saying, thanking everyone, acknowledging where people are, and then saying, if there is someone who wants to expand on how they're feeling, give them the opportunity and invite them to do so. Some people, one meeting, a few people really chose to do that, to the point of tears. And another meeting, no one did, but they were saying, thank you for at least allowing us to say this, right? And acknowledge where we are, and how that really, is kind of the lens and the emotions that people are kind of bringing to the work, even though we're all there for the same purpose. This is where we are and how we feel. And sometimes just the act of acknowledging something is really powerful and gets it out there.
Yeah, it's like, recently ran into this concept of silence breakers, and I instantly fell in love with it, because it's so easy to be silent because it's the safe thing to do. And also I think definitely in my career, just this reinforcement of like what professionalism is. Yeah. And professionalism became this thing that was so inhuman. Like, we weren't supposed to like bare our feelings or touch on some of these sensitive issues. And I think we do our best work when we're the most human we can be. And, and to your point, creating these moments of acknowledgement can get us there. And I wanted to just observe something that I've been tracking on, whether it's appreciative inquiry, or there's a really great liberating structure called Seen, Heard, and Respected. And this moment of reading those feelings out loud means that the people that wrote those they're feeling heard. And I was recently in an authentic relating workshop, and a gentleman pointed out how emotional it was to hear his story repeated back. And it really struck me, because I do a lot of this work, and so I'm around this type of stuff a lot. And went back to that moment, and I put myself in that gentleman's shoes and thought, wow, if that is an emotional moment, the reason that's emotional is because it doesn't happen much. So that means that like he's experiencing hearing someone really empathize, really understand. There's evidence that he was heard, and that was touching. And if we can create more moments like that, I think we can drive much more business value. But the problem is everyone focuses so much on the business value, they can't set the initial conditions to where that stuff can thrive and come out. So I love this notion of acknowledgement.
It doesn't 100% relate to business facilitation. but I went through a leadership development sort of class process. And there's this moment where it was like, what's one thing, that you would like someone to acknowledge you for or something? And so you wrote it on a sheet of paper and you didn't even know why you were writing it, right? Who would you want that person to be? And so I remember I wrote down that I was a good dog dad because my dog had passed away, right? And I would want it to be my pet, right? I mean, and the interesting thing was, hours later, she picked them up and she read them. And then I had to choose someone to play the role of my pet and acknowledge me for being a good parent, a good pet parent, right? To him, because I was carrying a lot of guilt. Don't get me wrong, we went to all the vets. I got all the medication. I did everything, but I couldn't change this outcome. And, as a type A person, who is so used to making things happen for everybody, for companies, I couldn't save, and so someone acknowledging me like they were my pet broke me down, but it was the most healing thing I think I had experienced in so long. I slept like a baby. I forgave myself. So that idea of acknowledging and kind of hearing things back, I don't know, it's a little bit off topic from business work, but there is a lot of power in that. And I think even from an employee perspective, you want to be acknowledged for certain things, from certain people, and how do we allow that to be expressed in some sort of way? So sorry for making a baby left turn there, but it was really powerful.
I agree. And these powerful moments are critical if we're going to build really resilient and really strong teams. And that's the kind of stuff that I think that I'm willing to invest in my team. The trust falls in the rope courses, whatever. But if we can authentically come together and be there for each other, if there is some weight on your shoulders about how the end of life around the dog, them taking the 30 seconds or the 2 minutes or whatever it took to say that, it's a very small investment that could have huge ramifications on your ability to work more closely together and drive those outcomes. And so if we focus on the health of the team first, we can have these profound impacts versus just trying to utilization and treating everyone like a factory and just go, 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 go. Yeah. And so I think that in a lot of ways, this is the best stuff we could be doing for business outcomes.
I think so. And no one in the room picked anything business related.
Right.
Not a single person. It was I said this to my grandmother and I didn't have a chance to say something else before she died. Right. This is where people were going. And this was a 3-month process, 2 weeks, but 3 months apart. But that's kind of, to your point, what people were bringing in, right? What they were carrying, what needed to be acknowledged. And then after that, I'll speak for myself. I can't speak for everybody, but I know I felt dramatically better and I felt sort of healed. And I wasn't, to your point, carrying that around with me all day and trying to do that and still facilitate for other people.
It brings me back to this notion of human connection. And when we held the big workshop right at the beginning of the lockdown for facilitators to kind of have a conversation around the future of facilitation, the one big thing was human connection. And it was interesting that on the spectrum, some folks were really concerned about losing it to the in-person human connection. We're getting really good at this digital stuff. Will we ever be able to come and have these moments we love? And so it was this kind of this fear of this dystopian future. Then the other side was just this notion of well, are we actually going to be able to do it? Can these tools support real human connection? It's interesting. We talked about this acknowledging and unburdening and supporting each other, but it really does come down to the human connection, and that's where we are most creative. That's how we solve stuff together, is when the connections exist. And so I'm curious to hear about your journey through the virtual space and how you've been able to maintain human connection. And do you have any tricks up your sleeve? Are you still experimenting with things? Just kind of what's there for you as far as human connection in this virtual world?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll be honest with you personally, right? So a lot of my friends will do Zoom things multiple times a week, but then I actually saw one of my friends and got a hug. And I was like, oh my gosh, I haven't had a hug in 8 weeks. I freaked out at first because, you're just not used to it. So I don't think there's necessarily a substitute, but one of the things we've been doing is from a facilitation standpoint, trying to mix it up. So they're like random breakout rooms and maybe, prompts that you can send people and bring them back in. There's videos, there's shorter time frames, like all of that stuff has been working, but you're still sitting there, right? Behind your computer. So those things have kept it more interesting for people. Also limiting the size of groups. So I know, there are the webinars, but also being able to see someone's face. And I know one of your articles that I think you just posted to LinkedIn, I read it earlier, was like, cameras have to be on, right? If your camera's not going to be on, then you don't need to be on the call for certain things, right? But usually we try to limit, because we do focus groups and research as well. And it actually has worked out pretty well to make those make them engaging. But I can't say that there's necessarily like the human connection. I think part of it is that thing about being an invitation, looking for the connection that I have with someone. So whenever I have an interview for like a focus group or research, do a little bit of what I call appropriate stalking, meaning I went to LinkedIn, I read some articles on folks and to try to figure out, do we go to similar schools or do we have, and try to make that connection and really talk about all of that first. So how sometimes at work, what would happen in a meeting is everyone talked about their weekends and all the things that had nothing to do with the meeting because everyone needed that. On Zoom calls, I try to sort of facilitate that, and I'll do my homework, even if it's something, someone I don't know for sure, do my homework and figure out, well, how can we make that connection? And how can I recreate that sort of experience where we waste the first 10 minutes? It's not a waste, right? It really does establish that human connection, and we laugh and we joke, and then we're able to easily transition into work because I know something about you, you know something about me, and it kind of gets back to sort of ingratiating yourself to someone else. So I just try to think, how can I recreate that first 10 minutes of every meeting that we all sit through over Zoom? And that requires a little bit of homework. And I'm okay with that.
Yeah, it kind of parallels this kind of researching their cultural norms, the words they use, so that if you can relate to them and make them feel like you care and you spent some time, that's a great way to open. Really love it, and I agree. Having that time up front, whether it's the weather report or like some sort of way for them to transition in. Sometimes people just need boot up time. They've been running from meeting to meeting and just kind of just jumping straight into it. It's not always the best.
And I will say the extrovert in me will write down, and one of my coaches, I feel like I've had a lot of coaches in my life, Douglas, but one of my coaches would say, write wait on a sheet of paper, and it stands for why am I talking? I don't know if you've heard this or not. I will usually write that, like wait, like why am I talking? And it's another way of saying hold space for people. But I don't have a problem talking. So if I just like shut up for a minute, usually someone's going to speak, right? Or they'll keep talking wait. That's another little technique that I have.
It's such a powerful facilitation technique just to use silence. And I was recently facilitating one of our weekly facilitation practices. So we'll host free event every Thursday where facilitators can come in and just try stuff out. We used to do it once a month, but now that everyone's virtual and trying to figure out this virtual stuff, we just started doing it every week. And it's been really fun because we've got a global audience and everything. But anyway, I was facilitating something, and while I had folks doing solo work and adding stickies to this mural, I was telling some stories just to kind of entertain folks. And then when we did the critique, because we always do a critique after people go, we'll do a roast, thorn, bud, just so that people can learn, because that's the whole point. Come, practice, learn. one lady's feedback was, your stories were so interesting that I couldn't think of what I wanted to write. Of course, I should shut up.
Well, but you have great stories. And nothing else, you remember the stories, right?
That's right. But yeah, I love this acronym WAIT. This silence is so important. I haven't heard that one before. So what other tips? Like, I guess from just navigating this crazy virtual world and launching out on your own, building your own company, what advice might you have for the facilitators out there that are following in your footsteps?
I always try to think of any meeting as an experience, right? And so to me, that's really important, whether it's the music that's playing when someone comes in. I mean, even when we've hosted webinars, like we'll have music playing to kind of like set the tone and let people know we're about to have a good time today. Some of the questions at the beginning. So I think if anyone can think about it as an experience and like walk people through and navigate them through the process, that would be my first tip, for anyone getting into the space. Number two, I would say think of yourself as a quarterback. For our company, we do a lot of work with culture as well, branding, etc. And we're always like, hey, we're a quarterback. We need a team. And nothing's going to get done without the people in the room. So even if you're at the front, reading the room, reading the defense, calling the next play is really important. And so those two things, and I would also say, oh gosh, we already said acknowledge, feelings, but also kind of getting people centered, is another thing in terms of the podcast. I mean, not podcast, but meeting, get people moving. If you can get people moving, that's fun, right? And so, I mean, we've done things by daring people like to stand up, because most people have on like, random shorts, even though business on the top and like party on the bottom, but work appropriate party on the bottom. But like what kind of PJs are you wearing? And to your point, I mean, in the practice that you all are doing and getting together with ideas, I've had friends who've done things from like quarantine kitchen, where like and it's like a random kind of a game. So like, I think this idea of prototyping, I think that's what I want to settle on. I probably rambled. So prototyping is the one thing that one of my friends mentioned to me, and he's the person I call all the time. He's very good at games and gamification, and we brought him in on projects. And the idea of thinking, just try it and prototype something and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, scrap it, right? But sometimes perfect just gets in the way of progress. And for me, I want things to be perfect. But once I just tell myself, it's just a prototype, then I'm able to move quickly and get feedback on it. And then I have the next iteration. And so for me, I think that's really important. And in this space, and what I know, my company and my business partner, what we've done, it's like, let's try this, let's try this, let's try this. And I just tell myself, it's just a prototype. It's just a prototype. It doesn't have to be perfect, because that has been the enemy of progress, where for me personally, in a space where you have to respond quickly. So that would be my one big thing that I've learned in the middle of COVID specifically and transitioning to virtual is prototyping.
Afternoon. I love it. As you know, I'm a big fan of prototypes.
Yes.
And so I will double down on that answer. Absolutely. If you're curious about something, afraid of something, a prototype can be really powerful, because it can give you the confidence to go give it a spin and see what works, see what doesn't work. And definitely perfection can be paralyzing and prevent it from trying and making that first step. So Harold, it's been a pleasure chatting with you today and hearing about the importance of timing, acknowledging, ingratiating your participants. Such a awesome concept. And then equifinality
yeah,
is now in my vocabulary. I love the word. It is something that explains something that I've known to be true, but in a way that packages it up in a really nice little box. I love it. And so just in closing, how can folks find you? How can they get in contact and potentially work with you?
Thank you for that. So Harold Hardaway on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there. I work at Cardigan, so you can find us at cardigancg.com. We help organizations with branding, internal communications, whether that's, campaigns, change management. Been getting a lot of calls, obviously, for the DEI space, as well. Find us there. You can email me at Harold, Harold, at cardigancg.com. And so, find me in all of those places. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I was excited and honored when you reached out. Wanted to know what little me had to say about anything. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a pleasure chatting today, Harold, and I look forward to talking more soon.
Yes, we will. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Control the Room. Don't forget to subscribe to receive updates when new episodes are released. And if you want more, head over to our blog where I post weekly articles and resources about working better together. voltagecontrol.com.